So good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome this afternoon to the Chamber webinar series. We're delighted to be joined today by George Skelton and Arnold Smith of RDA Accountants. And they're going to take us through today's webinar on the pandemic and unemployment payment. Just a couple of housekeeping things in relation to the webinar today. So we do have microphones and that closed off at the moment. But if you do have a question at any stage or you want to comment at any stage as we're going on through the webinar, please don't hesitate to pop them into the Q&A function or the chat function that's located on your screen. And what we'll do at the very end of the session, we'll be able to address any queries, or as if there is a specific query in relation to a section as we're popping along, Arnold or George might deal with it at that stage. Today's session is also being recorded, so we will make sure that details are shared with you and the slides can be sent out afterwards as well. But you will also be able to log on to the website, carlochamber.com, within the next 24 hours and access the webinar there to play back any section. So you don't need to be worrying about trying to take down notes and write everything down as fast as possible. So do enjoy the webinar, and we look forward to engaging with you. Thank you very much. George, I'll hand the virtual floor over to you now.
Thanks very much, Brian, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. Brian had asked us to have a look at the pandemic unemployment payment. So what we've decided to do is we're going to set out the scheme itself in the first few slides, and then there were some very specific queries that Brian had received from members of the Chamber that we're going to look at individually then as well. So this will hopefully answer a lot of the questions that you might have. If not, like Brian said, just type the question in, and while I'm talking, Arnold is there and he might be able to answer. If not, we'll deal with it at the end. And if we don't have an answer, we'll go away and get it and come back to you with it. But like I said, we're going to begin this by actually just starting from the start. I mean, at this stage, everybody probably knows what the PUP is. It's been so kind of widely publicised. Everybody knows of the 350 payment. That's kind of what happened in April, was the talk of the country that people were getting this 350 payment. So basically with the PUP, it is that 350 payment, if you like, and people were able to qualify for it provided they were laid off as a result of COVID-19. So the slide there now will show you all those specific requirements, but as everyone probably knew at the time, as long as you're between 18 and 66 and you lost your job or you were laid off as a result of COVID-19, then you were able to apply for this scheme and receive a payment of 350 a week. I suppose what's changed in the meantime, and what will continue to change today, so we're probably very lucky that we're looking at this today, are the rates of pay. So, like I said, out of work or self-employed people could qualify for this. The only people who didn't qualify for the PUP is if you were working 5-day week, for example, and suddenly your week was put back to 3 days. You know, so you weren't fully laid off, you just were working on a reduced week. In that kind of situation, you don't qualify for PUP, but you do get job seekers benefit or short-time working support. Okay, basically the same rules that had always been there for people who were working only up to 3 days a week. Okay, so that's kind of the PUP as everyone knows it, as it came into force earlier on this year. Like I said, it was in the news every day. Everybody knew people who went on this 350 a week. People who lost their jobs, or self-employed people who lost their income, publicans, people like that who just couldn't work as a result of COVID-19. So what happened in the meantime, I suppose, has been very little change. Like I said, we just said people apply, other than there was one change between March when this came into effect and today. So like I said, it's a very important day actually in PUP today, and it's probably makes it even more relevant that we're having this presentation today. So the only change between March and today is that originally everyone who applied for the PUP got 350 a week. So again, everyone heard of situations of students, people in college who were only working at the weekend were suddenly getting 350 a week. The reason that happened, I suppose, is that everything with COVID happened so quickly that the government didn't have time to factor in every possible kind of nuance. So they decided to get out there, and rather than leaving people with less income and crashing the economy, that they would just allow this PUP payment to be paid to anybody, no matter what their rate of pay was. About 6 or 7 weeks ago, they changed that, and they said anyone that was earning less than €200 a week, their PUP payment would reduce to 203. What's happening today is that they're putting a little bit more nuance in that, and that there's now going to be 3 rates of PUP payment depending on your previous earnings. So basically, they're breaking it down into, you'll see in the points there, if you earn less than €200 per week, you're entitled to receive a PUP payment of 203. If you earn between 200 and 300, the rate of payment would be 250 per week. So there's an anomaly there that you may have a situation where people actually receive less on the PUP payment if they fall in between that kind of bracket. And if you earn over 300 per week, you will receive 300 per week. Okay, so the 350 payment, the famous 350, is being reduced to 300. And then there's 2 even lower payments underneath that, dependent on your previous earnings, and if those previous earnings were below 300 or €200. So this is what the PUP payment will be from today, the 17th of September, up until the 1st of February 2021. Okay, so the PUP as it is to run until April 2021. But the current rates of pay will run until the 1st of February 2021. And at that stage, the 3 kind of layered approach will continue. So anyone who earns under 200 will earn 203 per week. If you earn between 200 and 300, rather than earning 250, come the 1st of February, you will go back down to 203. And then if you earn over 300, you'll no longer receive the 350 up until today, the 300 from today, but instead €250 per week. I suppose that is the kind of taper down the cost to the economy of PUP as this thing moves forward. Okay, when you get to the end, the hope is that there'll be very few people still on the PUP by April next year, but none of us know that. None of us can tell the future, and none of us can see where this pandemic is heading. The hope is, for instance, a lot of pubs, maybe not in Dublin, but a lot of pubs are opening next Monday. So the hope would be that people who had been employed in those pubs will go back to work. When that happens, it's important that you close your pandemic unemployment payment, or you advise your employees that they close their pandemic unemployment payment. So like I said, it's just a matter of advising social welfare that you're no longer in unemployed and that you no longer should receive the payment. Okay, so that is the real crux of the scheme. It was very kind of far-reaching. We probably never had a situation like this before, where everything just happened so quickly and people were caught unaware, and a scheme that was brought out that was just made to fit for everyone. And that's why the 350 for everyone started. Like I said, small changes since then, but the basic qualification criteria for the PUP remain the same. Have you lost work, or have you lost your job as a result of COVID-19, or have you been temporarily laid off, or has your business closed? Like I said, if you're self-employed, if you own a pub, if that's the case, you can qualify for PUP, and you can continue to qualify for PUP up until April 2021. And you could apply for the scheme. That's been extended recently as well. It had been thought the scheme had closed up until September, but that's been extended now until the end of 2020. Okay, so that's the scheme. It's not a very complex scheme because they didn't have time to make it complex. And that's where we're going to go through a number of queries now. And this is where the complexity is. And this is why it can be difficult to find answers, because there wasn't time to write the legislation to take into account all of these small differences or the anomalies that kind of happen in real life. You know, not everybody's job is the same. Not everybody's job is 9 to 5. And people work under different conditions and different circumstances. So, like I said, a number of members of the chamber had sent different queries to Brian over the last number of weeks and months. We've kind of taken all those queries now. We're going to work our way down through them. If you have any other queries as we do that, like I said, please feel free to jump in. So we're going to just work away on this. The first one is short-term work support. And I suppose I've already discussed this to some extent, in that there seemed to be confusion as to what happened when you work 5 days a week and now because of COVID your working week is being reduced. In that situation, it's not, you don't qualify for PUP, but you go on to job seekers benefit to replace the 2 days work that you've lost. Okay. Query 2, again, now we're going to get very specific, but I think the answers, we put a lot of detail into the answers to try and cover as much as we can. So this person has asked that if a staff member is on short-term notice until April 21 and claiming PUP, do you still accrue in-service time for both holidays and redundancies? That's a very good question. And what we kind of have to lean on there is the existing law as it currently stands. So in terms of annual leave, an entitlement to annual leave arises under the Act on the basis of hours worked, with the exception of sick leave. So if you take the situation of PUP, where people maybe were in work until April, we'll say, those people would have accrued annual leave up on that time. They were working as normal and they would have built up their hours. So like I said, where employees are on a period of temporary layoff, they do not accrue an entitlement to annual leave. Basically because if you're not in work, if you're not working up that time, you're not accruing annual leave. So if we break this year down as pre and post April, if you like, somebody worked up until April, they've accrued annual leave. Anybody laid off in the meantime hasn't accrued annual leave in that time, okay? Now, one thing we want to be very kind of clear on is that it should be noted that annual leave is looked at on an annualized basis, and an employee may still achieve a requirement of 1,365 hours. So this would be in a situation where perhaps somebody was laid off maybe for the month of April, but back in work in May. So they worked up until April and they're going to work the rest of the year. So while they might not have worked in April, they may still have worked enough hours to maintain their full annual entitlement. I think the minimum is 20 days annual leave. Okay, so look, it's something that will have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, but just I suppose that where the clarity is that the period of time where somebody is laid off, they're not continuing to accrue annual leave. At the end of the year, you'll have to look at the year in its entirety, see what time people had worked, what time people were laid off, and that can be used then to calculate any entitlement to annual leave. In terms of redundancy, again, we've gone back into the acts as they currently in the legislation as it existed before COVID. And under the Redundancy Payment Acts of 1967 to the 14, a layoff situation does not impact somebody's entitlement to redundancies. So continuity of service is not normally affected by a layoff. So, and that's only fair if you were to think about it logically. If you lay off a staff member who's worked for your business for 10 years, you lay them off in April and you take them back on in July, they don't lose that 10 years time in employment. So if in another 10 years time that person is made redundant, their entitlement will be based on 20 years rather than 10 from the time you take them back. Okay, so again, a very important question, a very important point. Your employees, or if you're the employee, your entitlement to redundancy will not be impacted by any short-term layoff. Okay. The next question again is a very technical question, and again something that people really didn't have time to put a clear answer on when the legislation came out. So the question is, how much notice do we need to give before a short-term layoff? Well, in normal circumstances, if you asked me this question last year, there are clear rules set out in terms of the notice period that has to be given. Okay, and you can see those on the slide now. When it comes to the PUP, there's no legislation. It does not stipulate anything in the legislation for a minimum period of notice. Basically, as much notice as you can reasonably give. We're in a situation where, especially when March, April, May, earlier on this year, where this thing moves so fast that people didn't have time. You know, for example, pubs just closed. I mean, so it'd be impossible for an employer there to give 4 or 6 or 8 weeks notice because they couldn't have possibly known themselves at that stage. So I think it's reasonable belief that with the temporary nature of the period of layoff, or short time will be construed in accordance with the circumstances where a decision is made. So basically, you give as much notice as you possibly can, given the circumstances we're all living in today. Okay. So query 4, again, another very specific query, as what wording do we need to put in the letter of notice for short-term layoff? Again, what I would say, every circumstance is different. So if you're in any doubt at all, speak to whatever HR professional that is advising your business at the moment. But what we have done is we picked out some of the main points that we believe should go in any letter to any employee. So I think it's important that that letter would involve a paragraph that confirms you're being placed on temporary leave as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, in line with the measurements the government has taken to deal with this emergency and in line with Section 11 of the Redundancy Payments Act. So this means the company are unable to provide the work you're employed to complete. The company do not foresee this as a permanent situation and hope to resolve the matter as soon as possible. This letter serves as notice of layoff. This will take effect on, and again, whatever date it will start from, and you will not be paid for the period that you were laid off. Depending on your personal circumstances, you may be entitled to financial support from the state, and you can apply for the COVID pandemic unemployment payment, which we would advise you to do online. Okay, so I think if you're preparing a letter for any employee and you can include those 5 lines in it, you'll go a long way. The rest of the wording is, will depend on the specific circumstances, but you have met most of your obligations. Like I said, if in any doubt, maybe talk to whoever your business uses for HR advice or for employee contracts. Okay. So query 5 then. If they're on short-term leave and claiming PUP, can they insist on redundancy? And if so, after what period of time? So again, previously, if you were laid off for a period of time, you could seek redundancy. So normally if an employee is laid off or put on short-term hours, they can claim redundancy from the employer after 4 weeks or more, or 6 weeks in the last 13 weeks. That's the normal rule. But that is not the case anymore with PUP. Okay, there was emergency legislation put in place that has meant that nobody can look for redundancy at the moment up until or before the 30th of November. Now, what I would say, that's currently the 30th of November. It had been the 18th of August. It's been extended 4 separate times so far. So given that the PUP is in place till April, there's probably a reasonable expectation that that date of the 30th of November will be extended further. So basically, as things stand, anybody laid off as a result of COVID and the COVID emergency can't ask to be made redundant or can't insist on redundancy. Now, that's how things currently stand. I'm sure within time, things will revert back to the normal rules, but at the moment, that's the case until the 30th of November. And I would have an expectation that that period will be extended, probably in line with the PUP itself. Okay. So we have 2 queries here, 6 and 7, and we've bunched them together, and query 8 as well, because they're very alike. Okay. So if an employee is on PUP, have 300 a week and are due holiday pay, can we just pay the difference between PUP of 300 and their normal gross pay and process the PRSI and POI via payroll and on the difference only? And the answer to that is no. Okay, an employee can't be on the payroll and in receipt of PUP at the same time. And then in query 7, in order to pay due holidays, the appropriate tax and PRSI, the staff need to be on the books, but can the middle-box getting paid holiday pay and qualify for a PUP? No is the answer. Really what happens is if staff haven't received their holidays, the thing to do at the moment is to accrue those holidays forward and to allow staff to take those extra holidays when they come back to work, or to be paid for those holidays when they come back to work. The staff can't be on the payroll and in receipt of PUP. And certainly there's no kind of scope in the legislation to use the PUP to part pay employees' holidays. So I think the answer to that is very straightforward. No is the answer. PUP is when somebody's laid off and is no longer on the company or the business's payroll. If there are holidays that have been accrued, continue to accrue those holiday days and take care of same when the employee comes back to work. And like we say in the last point here, it might be a situation where you'll have to be a little bit more flexible and allow employees to carry additional days forward into the new year. Okay, so query 8, like again, kind of mirrors that. We need to put staff on short-term layoff on the 1st of September so that they qualify for 300-week PUP. How do we handle holidays? Some have 20 holidays to take. Their contract employment states that all holidays have to be taken in the calendar year. So again, you cannot put the payment through while they're on PUP. You might just have to show a bit of flexibility in terms of company policies in terms of holidays, or perhaps pay holidays when they come back into work and come off the pub. Okay. Our next query then is, are they still entitled to bank holiday payment while on the pub payment? And if we have to pay bank holidays while on the pub, are they not getting paid twice for the same day? Okay, so again, there are specific public holiday laws that have been set out for a period of time. So they state that the statutory position in respect to public holidays is set out in section 21 of the Act, and it is open to the employer to determine how the day will be dealt with. There are 4 options that are primarily used. Okay, one is a paid day off, and the other is that a paid day off within a month that the public holiday happens, an additional day of annual leave, or additional days pay. Under the legislation, employees who are on layoff for more than 30 weeks lose their entitlement to any subsequent public holidays. So really it'll depend on for how long the person is laid off and for how long the person's on the pub. These are the specific rules in the current legislation for public holidays. Again, you cannot pay for the public holiday while they're on the pub. It may be a case that if they're back within the month, you can pay them then. If not, you might need to add that day to their annual leave entitlement for the year. And like I said, if they're laid off for more than 13 weeks, well then they lose their entitlement to any subsequent public holidays. Okay. So query 11, if they're on the pub, can they stay on it until business recovers, which may be until the end of April 2021? Well, yes, at the moment that's absolutely true. The pub is in place until April 2021. Hopefully at that stage, the economy will be in such a situation and the COVID crisis will be over and there'll be no requirement for it anymore. If that's not the case, what you'd expect to happen is the pub itself will be extended. But at the moment, certainly there's no issue at all with an employee staying on the pub until April 2021. The only difference would be that the amount they receive will change. So someone who typically earns €400 a week would have earned $350 up until today, or would have received $350, I should say, from the pub until today, will receive $300 between now and the 1st of February, and then will receive only $250 after the 1st of February. Okay, it remains to be seen what happens after April 2021. We'll have to wait and see. That's the great unknown, but the pub is in place until that time, and I'm sure the same situation as we are now, it'll be extended beyond that point. But sure, for all our sakes, let's hope not. Okay, query 12. If a staff member is on short-term leave and collecting social welfare for 2 days, do they qualify for PUP of 300 or 2/5 of PUP, i.e. 120, or do they get paid job seekers allowance? Okay, this goes back to what we've discussed, I think, earlier on. If your working week is reduced, you do not go on to the PUP payment. You work your 3 days a week and you receive one of the following support: short-term work support, job seekers allowance, or supplementary welfare allowance. So basically nothing has changed. Those were the social welfare payments that were always in place in that situation. Okay. So query 13 and 14 we've kind of put together. So it says, if we have to take them off PUF to pay holidays, can they go back on it again, even though it would be after the 17th of September cutoff date? Or do they then go on the job seekers allowance? So just to point out, that 17th of September cutoff date has extended now to the end of the year in terms for someone going back on PUP. But you should never need to take someone off PUP just to pay them holidays, you know. Like we'd spoken about earlier, just accrue the leave and carry forward until they return to work. There should be absolutely no situation where someone is taken off the PUP, paid holidays, and then put back on the PUP. Okay, so again, I think query 14 is basically the same thing. So like I said, some good news that 17 September deadline is no longer an issue. That's been put back to the end of the year. But like I said, just deal with the holidays as we previously discussed. So query 15, and this is important for anybody who's on PUP. Will the employee be taxed on the PUP payment that they receive? Yes is the answer to that, depending obviously on their overall tax position. So if somebody is on PUP for 2 months of the year, but they're working for the rest of the year, and that employment uses up their tax credits and bans, well then they will have a tax liability. It really depends on the individual's circumstances. As you're all probably aware, everyone has bans and credits each year. You pay tax once you go above the credits that are available, and you pay more tax once you reach a higher band. It's the same with the PUP. So the PUP will be added to all your income for the year, and then you will pay tax based on that income. But it is a key point, and it goes without saying that tax will be paid on the PUP if you have other income in the year. If it's your only income during the course of this year, well, obviously the tax that you pay will be a lot less. Okay. So we got some more queries here as well that we think just probably relate a bit more to the EWSS rather than the PUP, but they were there, so we're going to answer them. And I'd say there probably is a degree of confusion out there between the difference between all the schemes, and certainly there was, I know, in April when we were dealing with a number of queries from clients and from clients' employees, and people were kind of struggling to understand the difference between the two. The EWSS has replaced the TWSS, and it's a subsidy for the employer rather than a payment to the employee, where the PUP is a payment to the employee who has been laid off. It's basically a social welfare payment to a person who has lost their job. From speaking to Brian earlier, if we feel there's a need or if we feel there's an interest, we can certainly run an EWSS seminar in a few weeks' time, which deals with the EWSS itself in a bit more detail and a bit more specifically. But just these two queries came in. They relate to the EWSS, so we'll deal with them while they're here. So it says, do we need a tax clearance cert for the new wage subsidy scheme? And the answer to that is yes. So if you're hoping to register for the EWSS, maybe, for instance, we spoke earlier about publicans who have been closed, maybe opening business on next Monday, bringing staff back in, so their staff are coming back on the payroll. They may wish to register for EWSS so that they receive a payment of 203 for each staff member they have. Well, yes, they will need an up-to-date tax clearance to allow them to do that, okay? And then in terms of registering, the registration is done through ROS. If you want to register for EWSS, you go into ROS and you go into Manage Tax Registrations, and you will see an option for EWSS in there. If anyone's having any trouble with that, feel free to pick up the phone to RDA and we can talk you through it. It's a very quick process just to register the business for the EWSS. Okay, so like I said, a different scheme, an important scheme, but yeah, slightly different, but something that you might look at now as business opens back up again, especially the pub trade. Okay, so that kind of concludes the queries that we had and that specifically that we've dealt with. Like I said, the pub itself is very straightforward, but some of those queries were complex and very specific to certain cases. I don't know if anyone else now has any questions they'd like to ask. I don't see any coming through in the question and answers tab at the moment. There's one, let me see in chat. Okay, yeah, no, so like I said, does anyone, now is the time if you want to put anything in there. If not, if there's anything specific you want to ask separately, you'll see our colleague Marie Kenny's email address on the tab. If you want to email Marie directly with any queries, we'll absolutely do our best to come back and answer any queries you might have. But like that concludes really our short look at the pub. And like I said, hopefully it's something that we'll see in here less and less of as business starts to pick back up. But it's there should you or any of your employees need it in the months ahead. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, George, and to Arnold there in the background as well. I know if you do have any other questions, you know, you might have some more that could arise later on. Feel free to pass them through to us and we can get them through to George and Arnold as well, or else to Marie's email. And thank you very much to George and Arnold for taking us through this webinar this afternoon. I know we had a lot of very specific queries, but perhaps there may be something different in your business. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. Now we've got another webinar already scheduled, which is taking place next week. Again, it'll be on Thursday, the 24th at 2 o'clock, and it's a scenario planning website or webinar. It's coronavirus in the workplace, how to handle a case. So we look forward to seeing you then if you're available. And we will have a lot more webinars which will be popping up on our website in the next couple of weeks. In addition, as I said earlier on, today's session is recorded, so within 24 hours, you'll be able to log into it on the Chamber website and view back at the information, and we'll get the slides over to you. But for me, in County Carlow Chamber, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. I hope you found it worthwhile, and we look forward to seeing you again shortly. Thank you.